Welcome. I'd like to introduce Brian Kuan Wood, who is one of the editors of e-flux journal, and he's based in New York. He's been a long time friend and, I guess, writer about Hassan's work, and we invited him here tonight to give a talk that relates to the exhibition upstairs, and he chose to focus on the twist. So the talk is titled Do the Twist, and this is the last event related to the exhibition by Hassan, who's in the audience tonight, if anyone has any more questions. And the exhibition is open for 2 more days, so it closes on Sunday. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello? Can you hear me? Thanks, November, for this introduction and for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here at SALT, but also a huge treat to be able to see Hassan's exhibition, which is the first time I've seen such a comprehensive summary of his work, and after knowing him for probably over 10 years now, it's a really wonderful thing for me to see. So today I wanted to share with you a kind of loose constellation of ideas that I've been very interested in recently, which to my mind are related to a certain kind of instability that has seized many of our lives over the past few years. And I wanted to try and map this out a little bit and use it as a way of circling around a very complex work by Hassan Khan'ın called The Twist, which I think needs a kind of a vast terrain to unfold itself onto. And so I'm really playing with a few different ideas here, some of which will be more related to this work formally and in other ways, as a kind of incubator for a catalog text. So it's a kind of a draft. Some parts will hold together better than others, and so I hope you bear with me. So you've probably seen The Twist in the exhibition upstairs. My suspicion is that this simple shape can be seen as a marker of a hidden genealogy of movement, of an instability and anxiety that can be traced back in Western art history, at least to the Baroque. The more recent discussions of instability and contingency that touch our lives today, however, can be traced back roughly to the aftermath of 1968, with especially many Italian leftist thinkers who found it necessary to understand aspects of labor relations that escaped the rationalized and standardized formats of the assembly line. Thinkers such as Paolo Virno crucially identified that a layer of informal exchanges between individuals, even working on an assembly line, actually created the relations that made it possible for more systematic production to exist. It is crucially this layer of activity that cannot be controlled or regulated, and can therefore be seen as belonging to the workers themselves. But in an information-driven economy, this becomes more complicated, because knowledge is not only the engine of production, but also the product itself. As knowledge and ideas are by definition hidden, it becomes increasingly impossible to find ways of objectively measuring labor, and much less value, or even ethics. So over the 80s, as the strength of the Soviet Union was waning and Reagan and Thatcher proceeded to dismantle the welfare state, it was becoming clear that information networks were starting to allow new relationships to emerge between people in a way that did not require the state to act as a command center. This offered a kind of structural parallel to the neoliberal ideas that circulated since the 1970s, that markets can regulate themselves, that ethics could be networked, etc. The 1990s then seemed to vindicate all of these ideas when a massive economy blossomed out of the ability to trade information, and increasingly to trade capital. Communism was gone. Democracy, capital, and information networks could envelop the globe, and in many places, such as on the west coast of the US, where I grew up, especially there, it seemed that everything would be great, and we would all sail into a future of unlimited economic growth and prosperity. And I remember Uta Barth's photography circulating a lot around this time, and I think because the sensibility captured the moment very well. Also around this time, Ronnie Horn's amazing You Are the Weather, which was from 1994 and 1996, appeared, which was a series of 100 close-up shots showing the same woman, Margaret, in a variety of Icelandic geothermal pools through a series of facial expressions dictated by imperceptible weather changes. This is a pretty well-established theory of the recent past, but what is really interesting about these changes was the idea that ethics could be networked along the same lines of communication that form the improvised patterns of information networks. We can just make it up as we go along, it seemed to say. And this worked out well enough when the economy was growing and innovating, and entering seemingly uncharted territory each year, inventing new and unprecedented technologies for pleasure and wealth. But the 4 years since the financial crisis of 2008 have produced a steady collapse in just about everything, and we are now faced with a kind of sobering reality of how the communication platforms and capital exchange also produce systems of identification, and that those systems are actually completely dysfunctional. On the most basic level, the self-regulating ethics of the network were undermined completely by Wall Street traders who developed levels of complexity in their financial instruments that were impossible even for the traders to understand or interpret. On the one hand, they escaped ethical oversight, but on the other hand, they produced a kind of alien technology that skittered over the wires without anyone really understanding what it was. The funny thing about the economic collapse was that the complex financial products that drove the bubble to bursting were themselves created to understand and protect against the unpredictable and unknowable fluctuations of the future, of the weather. They were essentially packages of insurance bundles, which they called securities, and with any economy, a means of creating a shelter against the unpredictable and unknowable. But now that the roof has been torn off by the storm, one gets the feeling of being caught in the middle of a cyclone, of being unable to control one's own circumstances. Logics of necessity and force, of supply and demand, become more apparent than of artificial choice and entitlements to shelter and security. A sense of permanent instability takes hold and expands into a pulverizing psychosis. It becomes hard to tell what is collapsing and what is coming together. So this may be actually the place that Manuel Castells famously called the space of flows, the liquid spaces of exchange, which we had thought were online somewhere, or inside some computer, in a server farm somewhere, when in fact we've been living inside of this space the whole time without knowing it. This is the place where it becomes impossible to tell which feelings belong to you and which belong to the environment, to the weather. You feel as if you are no more than the sum of fluid atmospheric parts, and yet, paradoxically, the atmosphere itself starts to also assume characteristics of your internal psyche. It snows, you're cold, you're poor. In the sun, everyone's happy, you're rich, and everything in between. There is no more you, no more economy, no more weather. Everything merges into the same fluid drift. Ronnie Horn said in 2007, "Weather is the key paradox of our time. Weather that is nice is often weather that is wrong. The nice is occurring in the immediate and individual, and the wrong is occurring system-wide." So here we start to enter the world inhabited by Hassan Khan's pigs, which were his work in 2007, Stuffed Pig Follies, which is also included in the exhibition upstairs. It's a work comprised of animated pigs in various states of distress. But what is it that is causing them so much anxiety? Friedrich von Hayek famously emphasized the ability of the free market to send signals to indicate fluctuations in chains of supply and demand. This now seems quite sensible. One imagines something like traffic lights blinking over a sober assembly line or a street. In general, a kind of infrastructure that would suggest a sphere of objectivity, and clarity, and centralized organization. But when the product is subjectivity itself, my loyalty, lifestyle, my friendship, love, attention, identification, affiliation, the signal is no longer a light, but a mirror. The product, which is me, my social self, and the signal, indicating fluctuations in supply and demand, start to refract and amplify each other, very quickly cycling into becoming the same thing. I don't know, maybe you can read the caption. I hesitate when I meet my living face. And the last one was a platform to stand on. This one is this illogical barrier borrowed from somewhere else. The polite metaphor of binary signaling at the loading dock very quickly starts to break down. In fact, we left work a long time ago and are slaving away sending signals to ourselves and other people at the nightclub, the sleazy singles bar, flirting just to hear our own voice, trying on different personalities, giving and receiving pleasure and information so quickly that the distinction between producer and consumer starts to disappear. The only remaining trace of Hayek's signaling is my nervous twitch. In the meantime, I've been cast into a loop of affirmation and identification. Suddenly, I am in everything, and everything is in me. I'm a consumer and consumed. I'm producer and produced, surrounded by mirrors again. And I suspect this is also what the pigs are experiencing. So this is a bit of a jump, but now it seems quite strange to look back to a film such as Terminator 2, which came out in 1991, to find these two robots, which came from a techno-dystopian future, where information networks overtake the Earth and try to destroy the Luddite army of humans who created them. One of the robots, who travels back in time to protect the hero, is a friendly, antiquated machine, who is also later to become governor of California. While the other, evil one, takes the form of a much more advanced kind of liquid mirror, a pure, paranoid vision of an absolutely morphing psychic mass. But of course, this second, more terrifying machine actually comes across today as a deeply human portrait. Felix Guattari writes that to understand the foundation for subjectivity in biological or economic infrastructures, we have to redefine the way we understand the machine. So he writes, from now on, the machine will be conceived in opposition to structure, the latter being associated with the feeling of eternity, and the former with an awareness of finitude, precariousness, destruction, and death. As we become liquid, we try to identify some semblance of the friendly blinking light that Hayek mentioned. We try to recover a lost border between subject and object, producer and consumer, some way out of the recursive hysteria of the markets. We try to go the Luddite route and imagine a simpler and more straightforward time. And when we look outside of the cyclone, what do we see but the signals inscribed in weather patterns, another vast mirror? The sublime sense of encountering the unknown on the one hand, but without the place of refuge and without the security, we become the hurricane and the snowstorm and the cyclone, and vice versa. It is the sublime of experiencing the world as it is. Hito Steyerl has eloquently linked the sense of foundationlessness with being in a state of free fall. So she writes, paradoxically, while you are falling, you will probably feel as if you are floating, or not even moving at all. Falling is relational. If there is nothing to fall toward, you may not even be aware that you're falling. If there is no ground, gravity might be low, and you'll feel weightless. Objects will stay suspended if you let go of them. Whole societies around you may be falling just as you are, and it may actually feel like perfect stasis, as if history and time have ended, and you can't even remember that time ever moved forward. As you are falling, your sense of orientation may start to play additional tricks on you. The horizon quivers in a maze of collapsing lines, and you may lose any sense of above and below, of before and after, of yourself and your boundaries. Pilots have even reported that free fall can trigger a feeling of confusion between the self and the aircraft. While falling, people may sense themselves as being things, while things may sense that they are people. Traditional modes of seeing and feeling are shattered. Any sense of balance is disrupted. Perspectives are twisted and multiplied. New types of visuality arise. Still quoting Hito, this disorientation is partly due to the loss of a stable horizon, And with the loss of this horizon also comes the departure of the stable paradigm of orientation, which has situated concepts of subject and object, of time and space throughout modernity. In falling, the lines of the horizon shatter, twirl around, and superimpose. A fall towards objects without reservation, embracing a world of forces and matter, which lacks any original stability and marks the sudden shock of the open, a freedom that is terrifying, utterly deterritorializing, and always already unknown. Falling means ruin and demise, as well as love and abandon, passion and surrender, decline and catastrophe. Falling is corruption, as well as liberation, a condition that turns people into things and vice versa. It takes place in an opening we can endure or enjoy, embrace or suffer, or simply accept as reality. So, to go back to the twist, well, while Hassan is well known for his eloquence as a thinker and as a writer, the twist is a kind of interesting work because it's one that he doesn't really go into describing at length. In a conversation we did together about a year ago, he described it as a single sculpture, a stainless steel rod that runs from the ceiling to the floor. At 220 centimeters, the rod splits into 4 bars, which intertwine around each other to form a twist. At the height of 170 centimeters, the twist concludes, and the stainless steel rod becomes whole again until it reaches the ground. Still quoting Hassan. I'm constantly noting, in a non-systematic fashion, how things that exist in our landscape can suddenly lead to much more. This particular thing is an instance of ornamentation, and what makes it a bit interesting in the context concerns the fact that the twist in the metal serves no function for the railing. Also, because it is not serial, the logic of this ornamentation becomes structural. It speaks about the actual metal bar itself, its potential, and more interestingly, I imagine, the impulse behind it, unexplained yet eloquently summing up the basis of civilization itself, without trying to be precious about it. So summing up the basis of civilization, this is something that needs to be unpacked, you know? So the twist originates in a steel railing at a hotel in Alexandria. It is a common embellishment on steel railings that gives a bit of character and flourish without causing problems for anyone. It's an ambivalent form with no discernible history and no known tradition. 2 things are clear. It is not a straight railing, and the embellishment has no structural explanation. So its reason for being is probably cultural, or as Hassan puts it, civilizational. But there's one tradition that the shape does start to remind us of, and that is the Baroque. Interestingly, the Baroque, even in its origins, was itself the style of fluid change and the disappearance of absolute laws of rational composition and proportion. For many years, the Baroque was considered a low point in art history, a kind of nervous breakdown of high Renaissance ideals, and a period not to be touched by any serious scholar. It was basically seen as a mannerist stage of art that exploited theatricality and scale to elicit the maximum emotional response. Even its name, Barocco, in Italian actually means bizarre. And so, now, as before, we associate the Baroque with mannerism still, with kitsch and with the excessive display of Louis XIV's Versailles. It is the official style of the nouveau riche, of gangsters, of oligarchs, drug lords, hip-hop stars, and so forth. In this sense, the opulence of Baroque style functions as a desperate cry for attention that always carries with it a certain kind of sadness, a very forceful kind of melancholia that announces that everything I have today could just as easily be gone tomorrow. So these are a series of images I found online of a Russian, kind of very wealthy man in St. Petersburg, who is named Igor. But I think his expression kind of says it all. And in a very interesting way, This makes complete sense because the Baroque style in art and architecture has always been about physical movement and constant change, about time, instability, and rapture. Heinrich Wolffen was the first to take the Baroque seriously, even if he did it somewhat apologetically with his book Renaissance and Baroque, which he wrote in 1888 when he was only 24. What is interesting about Wolffen's approach is that he tries to come to terms with a real problem that the Baroque posed. After art had basically achieved perfection with the grace, balance, and harmony and the rationality of the Renaissance, how could it collapse into formlessness, into such a fanciful and eccentric style? So this is this is Bernini's Beata Ludovica Albertoni. It's a funerary monument he completed in 1674. So the problem is further amplified for a proper European man of the 19th century who understands historical progress in very idealistic terms, where greatness accumulates in a gradual advance towards perfection. So how can things slide so quickly from the Renaissance into this? He's asking. Interestingly, Wolffen provides an extensive analysis of Baroque style and architecture without mentioning a crucial change in the weather at the time, the Protestant Reformation. In the first half of the 1600s, the Baroque actually functioned as the de facto official style of the Catholic Church and the Counter-Reformation, which convened in the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563, to find a way to reassert its role after many of its followers began converting to Protestantism. As they did this, by using a distinctive new style that emphasized emotional pitch and the sensual side of religious rapture to counter the dry and dutiful Puritanism that the Protestants advocated. Nevertheless, it is fascinating to read Wolffen's introduction to Renaissance and Baroque because he explains the style in terms that could easily describe postmodernism, or possibly even contemporary art. And he writes, "Unlike the Renaissance, the Baroque style is not accompanied by theoretical rules. It developed without models. There appears to have been no sense of breaking fundamentally new ground, and as a result, the new style did not receive a name. Nevertheless, some new terms were introduced, such as capriccioso, bizarro, and stravagante, and anything unusual and uncanonical was greeted with approval. The spell of formlessness was beginning to work." So this is Wolffen. So there's a strange connection between the twist and one of the great Baroque sculptures, which is Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, which he did in 1622 to 1625. And I suspect that the connection provides a key for approaching many of Hassan's other works in the exhibition. The formal parallels are quite clear. Twisting upwards, the sculpture depicts a moment in Ovid's Metamorphosis, where Apollo, struck by Cupid's arrow, falls in love with Daphne and pursues her. To finally escape his grasp, out of desperation and exhaustion, Daphne prays to her father, the river god Peneus, who turns her into a laurel tree. Bernini's sculpture, like the twist, captures the instant of transformation as a cyclone, a terrible storm in which everything is suspended in the air momentarily, where Daphne begins her metamorphosis into a tree, and where Apollo has, for just a moment, captured the object of his love. It is a moment where a collusion of forces produces an opening, and out of this opening gushes a kind of fluid substance, or a kind of like a bloodstream of cultural garbage and crystalline ideological kernels, for just a moment before the clamps shut again. Thanks.